is a rather strange story from my teenage years. My grandparents owned a small farm tucked away in a little hollow. It wasn't a big commercial operation. It was just something they used to sustain themselves. As they grew older and it became harder for them to maintain the farm, they stopped using the barn. It just sat there, mostly used for storage. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, our family would gather at our grandparents' house. This story happened on Thanksgiving when I was 15. It was around that age when I started feeling like hanging out with the adults wasn't as fun as it used to be. Listening to stories from my childhood or my parents' childhood just didn't entertain me anymore. We had Thanksgiving dinner early, around 2 p.m. Afterward, I started getting a bit antsy. I let my parents know that I was going to explore the hollow a bit. It had been a while since I'd done that. I didn't even think to ask my younger brother and sister if they wanted to join me. Honestly, I felt like being alone. I knew I didn't have a lot of time before it got dark, so I set out with a rough idea of how far I could go and still make it back before sundown. I didn't do a great job of keeping track, though. If you've ever been out in the woods exploring, you probably know what I mean. Nature can easily capture your attention, and time slips away. It got very dark before I was anywhere close to being back home. By the time I returned to the farm, it had been dark for at least an hour. I had never been out by the barn when it was dark, and it looked incredibly eerie. Being a teenage boy, I liked scary stuff. I thought if the barn looked creepy on the outside, it must be even creepier on the inside. So I decided to check it out. Getting into the barn was easy. My grandparents rarely locked their house, let alone the barn. They lived in a very safe area, so they didn't think much about security. The barn did have one of those heavy wooden locks on it, though I don't know what they're called. But I managed to lift the wooden beam, and the barn door creaked open loudly. I was surprised it opened at all, considering my grandparents hadn't been in the barn for years. I figured the hinges must be nearly rusted shut. As I mentioned, the barn was old, and even when it was in use, my grandparents would only have been in it during the day, so there was no light. Thankfully, I had a smartphone with a flashlight. I turned on the flashlight and was fascinated by the eerie atmosphere. If darkness is creepy, then a little bit of light is even creepier. I was intrigued by all the tools, especially the sharp ones. Most of them were hanging up, but there was a small hatchet lying on a workbench. It was discolored, and upon closer inspection, I realized it was coated in dried blood. I didn't know much about slaughtering animals, but I knew my grandparents used to do that with chickens and pigs. So I assumed the hatchet was used for that purpose and was never cleaned. The barn had a loft filled with hay, so I decided to climb the ladder and check it out. While shining the light around, it reflected off something buried in the hay. I wondered if it was another tool, so I decided to investigate. As I approached, I began moving the hay, and that's when I screamed. Empty eye sockets of a long-dead corpse stared directly at me. I fell backward, nearly toppling off the loft. I quickly climbed down the ladder and ran out of the barn without even closing the door. I rushed into the house and told my parents and grandparents about what I had seen. My father, a large man, went out to confirm what I told him, and my grandparents phoned the sheriff's office. The body had been in the loft for about 3 years and had several hatchet wounds, which the police said matched the hatchet I had seen on the bench, the one I had picked up. So not only had I found a dead body, but I had held the actual murder weapon in my hand. That was truly disturbing. What's even more unsettling is that my grandparents had lived in that house for 3 years without knowing a dead body was in the barn. No one was ever caught, and to this day we have no idea who killed that man or why. I moved out of my parents' house right when I turned 18. Nothing against them. I just wanted to live by myself and live in the city. I got myself a small studio apartment in Chicago. I had to work both the day before and the day after Thanksgiving that year, so I wasn't able to go home. Instead, I had a lonely day at home in my own apartment. I'd never cooked a Thanksgiving dinner before and really didn't think that I needed that much food. So I just got myself a big TV dinner. I really hadn't realized how lonely I would actually be, though. In fact, the loneliness was so overwhelming that I also began getting cabin fever. I think in actuality, I just wanted to be around other people. So after I had eaten my TV dinner, I went out and went for a walk. It was cold outside, and there weren't a whole lot of people out. Since I had moved to the city, it was the first time I had not seen literally swarms of people everywhere. I walked around on the street by the bars, but knew I wouldn't be able to get into any of them. I was out for quite a while before I decided I just wanted to go back to my apartment and be warm. So I headed back. When I got to my apartment, I put the key in the lock. I opened the door and went in. My apartment was a studio, and the only other room it had in it was a bathroom. Having walked around the city for a couple of hours and not having gone into any buildings, I really had to go to the bathroom. I always kept the bathroom door closed. I went in and didn't turn on the light. I just used the light from the rest of the house. When I was peeing, I got the strangest feeling. I felt very uncomfortable and like someone may have been watching me. My bathroom, strangely enough, had a window in it. It was actually on the wall of the shower. So I turned to look out the window and expected to see a bird or something. Instead, I came eye to eye with the form of a person behind the translucent shower curtain. It was a person, and he was looking directly at me. Startled, I fell backward. He opened the shower curtain. I scurried backward out of the bathroom. I made it to my feet and went for the door. However, before I got out, I felt the man grab me from behind. I struggled, but all he did was take me and throw me across the room. He then left the apartment and the door slammed behind him. I got up as quickly as I could and locked the door. I then phoned the police. It didn't do any good, really. I noticed several items from my apartment were missing. Apparently the guy was a burglar and didn't expect me to come back. I just caught him in the act, and he likely wasn't intent on harming me specifically. I want to share an anonymous story with you without disclosing the location. This particular city is known for hosting a massive Thanksgiving Day parade every year. I'd never been to one before, but I always enjoyed watching it on TV. So one year I decided to go. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anyone to join me. None of my friends or family wanted to spend Thanksgiving braving the cold, I suppose. By the time I arrived at the parade route, it was already quite crowded. I was concerned about whether I'd be able to see anything, as I'm not particularly tall. However, I managed to find a spot behind another group of people that gave me a decent view of the parade route. As I stood there, I noticed someone who for some inexplicable reason just caught my attention. There was nothing particularly unusual about him. He was somewhat big and a bit unkempt. Nevertheless, there was something about him that made me keep glancing in his direction. A few times I caught him noticing me looking at him. Like anyone else, I'd quickly avert my gaze each time. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself repeatedly looking in his direction. After a while, I could sense that he was getting annoyed with my constant glances. I made a mental note to stop looking at him, but that only seemed to make things worse. As time went on, I looked at the man again and realized that he had moved closer to me. Initially, I didn't think much of it since people tend to shift around in crowded parades. However, the more I glanced over, the closer he got to me. He was doing it quite casually, weaving through the crowd. It was clear he was heading in my direction. To test his intentions, I decided to move towards the back of the sidewalk. When I looked at him, he immediately changed his course and started moving towards me. I became mildly alarmed, but I tried to reassure myself. After all, we were in a parade with thousands of people, and if he had any sinister plans, he'd be caught quickly. However, that's the issue with assumptions. They don't always account for every possibility. The man continued moving closer, and there was only one person between us when he stopped and pretended to watch the parade. I relaxed a bit, but when the person separating us moved, he pressed up against me. It was then that I felt something sharp against my back. He had a knife. Thankfully, he managed to hide it from any bystanders, appearing as just another guy in the crowd enjoying the parade. He repeatedly asked me why I was staring at him, and I was too scared to speak at first. But when he insisted and pushed the knife, I apologized and told him I didn't mean to stare. I had no idea who McMahon was or what he meant. He didn't believe me and kept pressing the knife, threatening me to tell the truth. My voice cracked as I pleaded with him to leave me alone, explaining that I had no idea what he was talking about. My words somehow reached the ears of two nearby guys amidst the parade's noise, and they asked the man what he was doing. I thought he might stab me then and there, but he must have realized that he couldn't get away in the crowded scene. So he discreetly put away the knife, ignored the two men, and quickly disappeared. They didn't pursue him, but made sure I was okay. To this day, I have no clue who this McMahon person was, but it hardly matters. I've certainly become more cautious about not staring at strangers since that day. Hello everyone! If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful or entertaining, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Your support motivates us to create more content you'll love. Thanks a million. And if you've just subscribed, please drop a comment saying I subscribed. We'd love to welcome you to our community.